What are you reading for? It's not an entirely stupid question. Once upon a time, reading was the obvious and often the only way to get hold of information. Stories, instructions, arguments, history, gossip, scripture, scandal, dangerous ideas. If you wanted to know something at length, you read. If you wanted to learn how to do something properly, you read. If you wanted to enter another world, you read. Now we watch someone on YouTube called something like Master Anything in 6 minutes, wearing a headset microphone and the expression of a hostage with a side hustle. And it's not entirely fair. Some videos are excellent. This one, for example, made by people who really do know what they're talking about, although finding them can be a challenge. This video was actually made in a moment of impertinent hypocrisy because it's made from a written article of the same name. But the shift is real. Reading hasn't been abolished, it hasn't been outlawed, it's just been quietly downgraded, eased aside and put on the back table like an elderly relative at a wedding, still present technically, just no longer central to the event. And that's odd, because the book was once the most radical technology humanity ever invented, and we've forgotten that. Now it's a slightly quaint object people arrange on coffee tables or behind them on the shelf for Zoom calls, where it can suggest seriousness without the inconvenience of being opened. But the book didn't merely accompany civilization. In many ways, it built it. I spent much of my childhood in books, not out of virtue, but out of necessity. They were an exit strategy. Disability, undiagnosed autism, domestic strife, ordinary life already had enough static in it. So books offered me another frequency. They were my looking-glass world. Through one cover, I could step into Prince Caspian's Narnia. Through another, I could ride with D'Artagnan and the Musketeers, or walk through dark forests with the Brothers Grimm. And that's one of the strangest and most powerful things about a book. It doesn't merely show you another place, it lets you create one inside your head and live in it for a while. Nowadays, we tend to think of books as old, calm, civilised things. A row of them behind someone on a video call can become a kind of intellectual taxidermy. Look, it says, once I had thoughts, or at least I bought them. But the book was cutting-edge technology, not metaphorically, literally. It was, and still is, an information machine. A device for storing thought, duplicating it, transporting it, standardising it, and preserving it beyond the lifespan of the person who first had it. That's a remarkable invention. Unlike many remarkable inventions, we got so used to it, we stopped seeing it. But before books, there were stories. Stories in the mouth and the ear. Songs, myths, legends, warnings, epics. Homer's Iliad belonged first to an oral tradition long before it was ever stabilised as text. Oral culture was humanity's first great storage system for memory. The book didn't invent stories, it industrialised their survival. This matters because people sometimes talk as if books created imagination when human beings were already doing a perfectly competent job of lying, remembering, dramatising and passing things on long before anybody stitched some pages together. So the book is not the origin of the story. It's the thing that made story durable, portable, and eventually scalable. That's a different kind of power. Then printing arrived and changed everything, eventually. Johannes Gutenberg is credited with building the first mechanised printing press in Europe, and by 1455 he'd completed the Gutenberg Bible, one of the earliest major books in the West printed from movable type. That sounds a bit like a museum label, but it is in fact one of history's hinge points. A machine appears and knowledge stops behaving like a local rumour. Before printing, knowledge was slow, scarce and controlled. Books were copied by hand. That made them expensive, rare, and mostly held by institutions with robes, money, bad haircuts and walls, or all four. Knowledge travelled but badly, at the speed of handwriting, horses and permission. If a manuscript vanished, the thing itself could vanish with it. Civilization could lose an argument because a monk had poor lighting. Scarcity doesn't just limit access, it shapes thought. When books are rare, reading is limited. When reading is limited, knowledge remains local, hierarchical and fragile. You know what is near, what is approved, what someone with more power than you has decided is suitable. That's a tidy arrangement, especially if you happen to be in charge. Printing came along and made things untidy. The point wasn't that more books could exist, the point was that the same book could exist many times over, in many places, in approximately the same form. That meant standardization, stability and scale. A scientific idea, a religious challenge, a political tract, farming manual or dirty joke could spread far beyond the room in which it first appeared. Print didn't improve human nature, let's not get carried away. It spreads nonsense as efficiently as truth, panic as efficiently as reason. Give people a new communication system and they will use it for theology, fraud, nationalism, pornography, and being wrong with impressive stamina. But it changed the balance, it made knowledge cumulative and it made dissent portable. It made authority leak. In England, William Caxton set up a press at Westminster in 1476. Unusually though, he didn't begin with the Bible. The first dated book he printed in England was the Dictates and Sayings of the Philosophers on the 18th of November 1477. Not a novel, a compendium of moral sayings and edifying wisdom translated into English from French from an earlier Arabic source, which means that one of the first dated books printed in England was already an imported bundle of recycled wisdom. That feels oddly modern. So even at the beginning, print was not some pure fountain of original genius. It was translation, compilation, repackaging and intellectual freight forwarding. In other words, publishing. One of print's less glamorous achievements is that it gradually taught language to behave as if spelling mattered, which probably came as an unpleasant surprise to quite a lot of the English language. And somewhere in the middle of all this, stories changed too. The tale of Genji, written at the start of the 11th century, is often treated as the world's first novel, and then Don Quixote is often treated as the first modern one. The distinction is useful. Genji proves that books were already capable of extraordinary psychological subtlety about 1,000 years ago. Don Quixote, published in 1605 and then in 1615, feels modern because it's self-aware. It understands that stories do not merely describe reality, they infect it. Which makes it rather perfect that Don Quixote is also commonly cited as the best-selling novel of all time. The exact number's foggy because old sales figures have a habit of turning into folklore, but the symbolism is too tiny to ignore. The novel that taught fiction to look in the mirror still sits by most reckonings at the top of the table, irritatingly neat and a little bit suspicious. Still, the revolution of the book was not only literary. And this is where people get a bit misty-eyed and miss the more important point. The book did not just preserve stories, it preserved procedures, it standardised instructions, and made a picnic of know-how. The modern world was not built only on epics and scripture, but on manuals, textbooks, maps, diagrams, timetables, pharmacopoeias, and repair instructions. The book gave us the manual. There used to be paper manuals for all sorts of things, cameras, tape machines, stereo systems, software. There was a time when you could buy something like Photoshop and be given a printed kind thick enough to stun a burglar. The assumption was simple. This tool is complicated, and if you want to understand it, you will read. You will sit with the object, the explanation, and your own patience, and competence will slowly emerge, with occasional swearing. It all sounds kind of antique now. These days we search, skim or watch a tutorial. We find the exact 2-minute clip that shows the one thing we need right now and then forget it 10 minutes later. We no longer expect to know a system, we want the next answer. So the manuals become the online tutorial and reading has become retrieval. And even that shift has a history. Haynes manuals were iconic DIY car repair books that taught generations of British motorists how to service and repair their own cars without having to first apprentice themselves to a man called Derek in a freezing shed. Across the range, they sold more than 200 million copies worldwide. In 2020, Haynes stopped producing new printed manuals for new cars. The details matter less than the direction of travel. Knowledge that once arrived as a solid object that you owned, with pages you flicked through and corners you bent over, now arrives as access. Brief, searchable, contingent access, usually interrupted by an advert that you something you don't need or respect. And this is where the book's real strength starts to look inconvenient. What books demand is active imagination. Even great cinema does much of the imaginative work for you. However brilliantly, the faces are cast, rooms are dressed, the weather is chosen, and the music's already there telling you how the air should feel. A book does something stranger. It hands you words and asks you to build a whole world yourself, privately, inside your own head. And that's one of the reasons reading feels harder now. It's not merely slower, it asks more of you. And some of that difference may be physical as well as imaginative. Reading a book is a small bodily collaboration between page, hand, eye and brain. You feel your way through it. You know where you are in the object. You remember that something mattered because it sat halfway down the left-hand page near the end, or because your fingers were already a third of the way through the thickness of it. A screen gives you text, certainly, but it removes that tactile spatial orientation. That may be one reason paper still seems to support deeper comprehension, especially when reading is long, demanding or serious. A book, in other words, does not merely contain thought, it stages a meeting between thought and patience, which is not, at present, a fashionable pairing. Now, this doesn't mean people have stopped reading. Sit in any cafe and you will see them reading off their phones. Messages, headlines, essays, comment threads, thoughts, and occasional arguments so stupid it briefly restores your faith in print. The modern world is saturated with text. It's dripping with it. What's changed is the shape of reading. It has become fractured, intermittent, opportunistic, something done in gaps. What has weakened is not the reading itself so much as the sustained reading, the deliberate act of setting aside time for a book and entering it whole. That's what a book still asks for. Duration. Not just a glance or a scroll, a block of life, a room in the day. And I'm not unaware of the irony here. I'm perfectly capable of sitting in a cafe, dictating an article about fractured reading habits into my phone. None of us gets to deliver this sermon from a cave. But that is partly the point. The question is not whether we use these systems, of course we do. The question is what kinds of thought they encourage and what kinds they make harder. The numbers aren't cheerful. The Reading Agency's 2025 report says that 53% of UK adults consider themselves regular readers. The same report says 46% of adults struggle to focus on reading because of distractions, rising to 55% amongst 16 to 24-year-olds. Nearly half the country is now telling us, with admirable honesty, that its attention span has the structural integrity of damp toilet paper. Books haven't vanished, far from it, but reading no longer seems culturally central in the way it once was. The object remains, the habit weakens. We still buy books more loyally than we practice them. In some homes, the unread pile functions less as a library than as a decorative statement that says, "Look, I read." The dust is usually a giveaway. Reading a book isn't just decoding words, it's sustained intellectual labour. It's one of the few remaining activities in which you're expected to sit still and meet complexity on its own terms. No soundtrack, no jump cuts, no smiling man in a cap saying, "Hey guys, today we're going to break down Tolstoy in 4 minutes." And yes, people would rather watch a video than read a book, which is awkward given that this argument has ended up on a video, but that doesn't weaken the point, it makes it contemporary. The medium that displaced reading is now one of the few places left to explain why reading matters. None of this is a plea for some golden age of noble readers communing with Dickens by candlelight while outside the poor died tastefully in the fog. The past was full of exclusion, illiteracy, drudgery and bad books. And plenty of people never had access to serious reading at all, and those who did quite often used it for empire, theology, bookkeeping and fraud. The point isn't that the past was better, it's that the book was once understood as a serious technology of thought. Now we often treat it like a lifestyle accessory, somewhere between a scented candle and the artisanal lamp made out of sourdough. That may turn out to be expensive, because when deep reading declines, other things go with it. Patience with ambiguity, capacity for sustained argument, historical memory, resistance to manipulation, and tolerance for complexity. A society that no longer reads deeply becomes easier to govern by slogan, clip, panic, and emotional weather. This doesn't mean every reader is wise, God knows that would be ridiculous, but a culture built on fragments thinks differently from one built on books. Usually it's faster, and usually it's shallower. Thoughts and opinions arrive with far more confidence than the situation warrants, which is more or less the governing style of the age. The book changed the world slowly enough that we underestimate it, which might be its final trick. It became so successful, it disappeared into normality. We no longer see it as a machine because it worked. We no longer see reading as a discipline because literacy became ordinary. We mistake familiarity for triviality. But the book helped make modern consciousness possible. Gutenberg's press in the mid-15th century did not merely produce objects, it altered the conditions of knowledge. Caxton helped print English into a more stable form in the 1470s. Cervantes published Don Quixote in 1605 and 1615, just as prose fiction began to understand itself. The modern world was printed long before it was coded. So I ask again, why are you watching this? Whatever the reason, I'm glad you are. For now at least, there are still a few of us left willing to do half the work.